A Defense to Queenside Openings by Michael Basman. If you like defending actively, you probably find defending against the queenside openings, and that includes the English and the Reti setups, rather difficult. Most lines seem to give white a small positional edge, which suits your opponent fine, and he can proceed to build it up gradually. Meanwhile, if you do anything but defend stubbornly, you're liable to lose even quicker than you would otherwise. Unlike defences to one pawn to e4, it's not easy for black to seize the initiative early on, and therefore a rather different approach is called for. The defense I wish to show you on this cassette provides solidity and security, if you're looking for that sort of thing, and also gives the opportunity to play dynamically in some lines very early on in the game, in others later in the middle game. Most of the material for this cassette comes from my own games of the past year, and though I did not win all of them, nevertheless I won nearly all, or I could have won nearly all. Furthermore, the games proved entertaining, and for once I did not feel a sort of positional inferiority complex, which is the usual outcome of facing the queenside openings. Well, please have your board and men ready, and we'll make the initial moves. One pawn to d4, black pawn to d5, white pawn c4, and black pawn c6. This is the trademark of the system. Of course, it's well known as the Slav defense, and from the start you can see that black does not intend to give way in the center. He has a pawn at d5 and supports this with another. He could have played pawn to e6, which is more popular, but precisely because pawn to e6 is so regular, white will be well primed to meet it. Also, black pawn to e6 will block the queen's bishop, which black pawn to c6 does not. It's true that pawn c6 takes away a development square from black's queen's knight, but that piece may still come out at d7 or even e6. There are three main types of position that can now arise. The first occurs when white simply supports his center by pawn to e3, which incidentally guards his c-pawn. White later develops his pieces gradually, and as black I have generally chosen a fianchetto on the king's side. Then there are positions where white exchanges on d5 early on, leading to a symmetrical pawn formation and symmetrical knights as well. Quite often they appear on c3, f3, f6 and c6. Finally, there are positions where white allows and black chooses to capture the pawn on c4. White nearly always regains the pawn, and then we get a pawn structure with the white pawn at d4 versus the black pawn at c6, and two half-open files, one for white and one for black. Diagrams 1, 2 and 3 show the types of pawn formation which generally arise in this opening. Generally speaking, types 1 and 2 will be more solid, and type 3 more aggressive. First, we'll look at a game between international master Vanisic from Canada and me, played at the Lloyds Bank International in July 1977. This is an example of the first type of pawn formation. The game began with white playing his pawn first to c4. So if you reset, we'll start. White plays pawn c4, black pawn c6, white pawn to d4, and black pawn to d5. Now white goes knight to c3, black knight to f6. White pawn moved up to e3, pawn to e3, and black pawn to g6. White knight f3, black bishop g7. White bishop e2, black castles, and white castles. The development of black's king side has been obvious, and now black must set about his queen side. I decided to leave the queen's bishop at home for the time being, as it is useful guarding the queen's knight pawn, that is, the b pawn. And so I played knight from b8 to d7. White bolstered his center with pawn to b3, and black moved knight to b6. The knight looks strangely situated here, but it seems quite logical, since the only contact between the two armies at the moment is at d5 and c4. Those squares are kept under surveillance. Also, there is a possibility that white will be enticed into playing pawn to c5, when after the black knight retreats, the pressure on d5 will have been relieved, and black will be able to plan his own central expansion with pawn to e5. After black had moved his knight to b6, white played bishop to a3. He could have placed this piece on b2, but this is a more active diagonal. Black moved rook to e8, breaking the pin on the e-pawn, and white played rook to c1. Up to this point, white had been moving smoothly and quickly, so I suppose I was a bit annoyed and played pawn to h5 here. White pretended nothing had occurred and moved rook to e1. Now at last the black bishop came out to e6. The first direct threat of the game, to capture on c4, and this finally stung white into action. He played his knight from f3 to g5, attacking the bishop at e6. Black moved away with bishop to g4. White pushed pawn to f3. And now if black retreats to f5, white will probably expand with pawn to e4. Thus, instead of moving his bishop, black chose bishop to h6 here. Clearly, in this position, desperados such as knight takes f7, followed by pawn takes g3, pawn takes g4, are not going to work, because black has bishop takes e3 check at the end of this, forking the king and the rook. So white supported his knight with pawn to h4. A glance at the respective kingside positions shows that both sides are now playing with fire, but no doubt it is the very solidity of the central position that allows these wing advances to take place. Black now moved his bishop from g4 back to f5, and I'd like you to switch off here and study the position for not less than 5 minutes. Before continuing further with our analysis of the game, let us consider some of the positional and psychological aspects of the confrontation of pawns at c4 and d5. They've been in that situation since move 2 now, yet neither side has exchanged them yet. The idea of maintaining the tension, that is, not exchanging pawns that could be exchanged, is an important one in chess. While the tension is maintained, options are open, and thus in some way the position is more alive. Whoever breaks the tension by exchanging may do so if he sees an advantage, but often it becomes a matter of honor to preserve the tension, and thus the life of the position for as long as possible. The breaker of the tension may frequently feel himself the moral loser. In this position, which is diagram 4, White would ideally like to push his pawn up to e4, but he can't do this as it would lose a pawn after Black captures at e4 and then at g5 with his bishop. Possibly White could play bishop to f1 here, though Black then might start to stir up trouble with a move like queen to b8, threatening to settle in on g3. No, White decided to exchange pawns in the center, and this he did with pawn takes on d5. How should Black recapture here? He too can't do everything that he wants. If he goes knight from b6 takes on d5, then White will capture himself on d5, and then if Black once again captures with a knight, pawn to e4 will win a piece. So, from the position in diagram 4, after White pawn takes on d5, Black recaptured with his pawn. If you had intended White knight to b5 here, threatening a fork at c7, you should also take note of Black's defense, which is after White knight to b5, Black rook to c8, knight takes on a7, rook takes c1, White queen takes c1, and now Black queen to b8, knight back to b5, and queen to g3, which seems to win the h-pawn. So, instead of this line from diagram 4, after the exchange of pawns, White played bishop to b5. Black dropped his bishop back to d7, and White placed his own bishop more aggressively on d3, bishop to d3. Now the game trundles on a little bit more. Rook to c8, bishop to b2. White is preparing for e4 and wants to give his d-pawn more cover. Black knight to h7. White knight takes on h7, and Black king takes on h7. Here Black has a smallish threat of pawn to e6, followed by queen takes h4, so White played queen to d2 in order to transfer this piece to f2. This is the position in diagram 5. I'd like you to switch off again and study the position. I think 10 minutes will do here. What should Black play here? Possibly something quiet like bishop to c6, but he chose pawn to e5, trying to take immediate advantage of the pin on the e-pawn. This throws up as many problems as it solves, and from now on it's anyone's game. After Black pawn to e5, White captured pawn takes e5, Black moved pawn to d4. This is the point of his play. White moved his knight to e4, which is the point of his play, because if now Black captures on e3 with his bishop. White will just play rook takes on e3, and then the kingside pawn weaknesses which black has will become very troublesome to him. You only have to consider white has a knight on e4 and a bishop on b2 to see what I mean. Well, black did not capture on e3 with the bishop. He played pawn takes e3. And here if white tries knight to f6 check, black would play queen takes knight, followed by pawn takes queen. So white has to move his queen first, and what square should he put him on? I'd expected him to go queen to e2, but in fact he came out with queen to b4, which is much more aggressive. Black moved knight to d5, attacking the queen and also defending the f6 square from white's knight check. White moved queen to d4, once again threatening the knight. In this very complex situation, please stop the cassette and defend for black. Well, black needs to exchange the rooks first, otherwise white may do so himself and then drop his knight in at d6 with a fork. So black chose rook takes c1, and now white had to choose his recapture himself. He really has to recapture with the bishop, though it does take that piece off the long diagonal, because recapturing with the rook would allow black to play bishop to e6, and then there would be some underground threats of black moving pawn to e2 at some stage, followed by bishop to e3 check, or even bishop takes rook. Besides, recapturing with the bishop, which is what white did, gives him chances of picking up the black pawn at e3 sometime. So white moved bishop takes c1, and black bishop to e6, defending the knight at d5. White played bishop to c4. What can black do here? There's just a simple threat of bishop takes d5 and knight to f6 check. Most spectators were under the impression that I was completely smashed here, so please switch off and try to find a way for black to get out of it. Black has no time for subtleties here. He's down to one move defences. His move was queen to a5, attacking the rook at e1 and setting white a disconcerting problem. Should he defend the rook with king to f1, which allows black to play queen takes a2, or should he move the attacked rook, and if so, where? If it goes to d1 or f1, it's liable to be attacked later by pawn to e2. So eventually, white chose the natural answer to queen to a5, which was rook to e2, not only blockading the e-pawn, but also defending a2. Black's answer here was rook to c8, getting his rook off the forking line and preparing to capture the bishop on c1 should white now take on d5 with his bishop. White did not do this, but moved his bishop from c1 to b2, renewing the threat of a capture on d5, followed by forks and things. Well, as the black rook is no longer at e8, the threat of a check on f6 is not so fearsome, so black was able to move his attacked knight. This piece went to f4, attacking the rook at e2. White played rook takes e3, and black bishop takes on c4. Now for a change, look at the position from white's point of view and decide how you would continue. It is diagram 7. I was quite amazed in this position when I saw my opponent's next move, for I expected him to play the drawing line pawn to e6. Let's look at that. Pawn e6, black knight captures on e6. Now white knight to f6 check. Black king goes back to h8. And white rook takes e6. This solves the problem of black's queen being under attack and also his rook being under attack. Black must answer pawn takes rook here. And white plays knight. Well, where should white play his knight? Well, if white plays his knight anywhere except d5, black would be able to block the attack by playing pawn to e5 himself. But anyway, white would play knight to d5, discovered check, and black would have to play king to h7, after which white would carry on with knight to f6 check. And it seems to me we get a draw by perpetual check. This draw would have been the correct result of the game, yet white did not see it, fortunately. So let us return the pieces as in diagram 7 and play white's actual move, pawn takes on c4. Black blocked, of course, by knight to e6, and this move even wins the exchange for what it's worth in this position. The main thing is that the knight getting back to e6 in time blockades the e-pawn, and therefore white's attack is stopped completely. After black knight to e6, white moved his queen to d3, and here instead of capturing the exchange, black played on white's nerves a bit by going queen takes a2. White moved rook to e2, and black won the exchange again with knight to f4. Obviously white is really falling apart now, so he threw everything forward in an attempt to escape, an attempt which almost succeeded due to the factor of chance, which determines time scrambles, and there was a time scramble coming up here. After knight f4, white moved knight to f6 check, black king to h8, white queen to d7, hitting rook and f-pawn. Black knight takes e2 check, white king to f2. Black queen takes on c4. White pawn to e6, uncovering once again the deadly force of the queen's bishop on b2. Black played queen takes on e6, grabbing all he could, and white knight takes h5, discovered check. Switch off again here and decide quickly what move you would play here as black. You've got about 1.5 minutes. Black's proper move here was bishop to g7, preparing to answer white bishop takes on g7 check by king to h7, and then if white does not wish to exchange queens, he must play queen to d3, pinning the g-pawn. But then black knight to c1 looks a killer. White will just be too much material down at the end. Instead, returning your pieces to diagram 8, play the actual move made, knight to c3. Alas, white did not have time to notice the flaw in this move and checked quickly on d4 with his queen. Had he captured on c3 with the bishop and then played queen to d8 check, followed by knight to f6 check and knight to e8 check, he could have had a draw. Well, he didn't get any more chances. After queen to d4 check, black moved pawn to f6. White knight took on f6. And now black finished off. Bishop to e3 check. White queen takes on e3. Black knight to d1 check. White king to g3. Black knight takes on e3. And white resigned. If you've recovered from that game, we'll look at another continuation in the same variation. The white player here is J.G. Cooper, the Welsh international, and it also occurred in the same Lloyd's Bank tournament, but in this case in the last round. Now, the move order was different, so we'll go through it again. The game begins one knight to f3, black pawn to d5, white pawn to c4. This seems to be some sort of reti. Black plays pawn to c6, the characteristic formation, and white moves pawn to e3, black knight to f6, white knight to c3, black pawn to g6. The bishop is developed in this way to give the other one free play along the c8 h3 diagonal. Naturally, it was quite possible to play bishop f5 or bishop to g4 here, and then follow up by pawn to e6. Well, after black's pawn to g6, white played bishop to e2. Black bishop g7, white castles, black castles. White pawn to d4, knight from b8 to d7, white pawn to b3, black knight to b6. And there we are, we've got the same position as in the previous game, but with a completely different method of approach. Here, however, white deviated with pawn to a4, a more aggressive continuation than Vanisic's, but one which also leaves white with possible weaknesses at b4 and b3. Black did not wish to countenance further space gaining by white, so he pushed his own pawn to a5. He has to bear in mind here that he also has a possible weakness at b5 himself. That is, should white capture at d5 and black recapture with his c-pawn. But in this particular position, black will be liable to recapture on d5 with a piece, which will give him the opportunity to move that piece to b4. White's answer to black pawn to a5 was bishop from c1 to a3. Black rook f8, move to e8, and white rook moves from a1 to c1. And now at last black developed his bishop, bishop from c8 to g4. White responded knight to e5, and black dropped his bishop back to e6. Had black moved first to e6 with his bishop to put pressure on c4, then white might have played knight to g5, attacking this piece. By playing the bishop to g4, then back to e6, black ensures that this piece cannot be disturbed there. White must have been attracted by the possibility of playing pawn to f4 himself, but in that case black can continue calmly with knight from f6 to d7, ejecting the piece at e5. Instead of pawn to f4, white played to enforce the advance pawn to e4 by moving his queen from d1 to c2. I'd like you again to switch off here and study the position for about 5 minutes. Black could have chosen to challenge white's advanced piece at e5 by knight from f6 to d7. In fact, he retreated the knight at b6 to c8. This looks logical because white is trying for pawn to e4, and black's knight, when it reaches d6, will attack that square. As a general rule, if you make retreating or backward regrouping, such as this, you have to make sure that your opponent isn't able to expand in the center while you're doing it. In this case, as you can see, an immediate pawn to e4 by white would just lose his d-pawn. On seeing black's knight recoiling to the bottom row, white decided it was too much and struck on d5 with pawn on c4 takes on d5. Black recaptures with his knight, and white played knight takes d5, and black bishop takes d5. White now continued his aggressive play with pawn to e4, and black retreated his bishop back to e6. Now white moved rook from c1 to d1. I think rook to from f1 to d1 looks more natural here, but white was obviously toying with the idea of advancing his f-pawn at some point. Therefore he wanted to keep his other rook behind that pawn. Black now moved knight from c8 to d6. This is the position in diagram 9, and I'd like you to switch off here and familiarize yourself with it. Up to now, black has just been playing defensively, waiting for white to punch himself out. Indeed, white began to show signs of uncertainty here. His natural advance is pawn to d5, but in that case black simply captures and then plays his bishop out to f5. White pawn to f4 also looks strong, but then I think black has adequate response in either moving his own pawn to f5 or playing queen to b6. Eventually, white decided to reposition his knight at e3 in order to exert more pressure on d5. He played from diagram 9, knight on e5 to c4. Black moved rook from a8 to b8, white knight from c4 to e3. Here black took the opportunity to threaten something, his first of the game, with queen to b6. a double attack on b3 and d4. White countered both these threats by pushing his pawn up to d5, an advance which is going to net him the two bishops, but no definite advantage yet. Black exchanged pawn takes d5, and white played knight takes d5, black bishop takes d5, and white rook takes d5. He doesn't really want to recapture with the pawn because that pawn would be quite well blockaded by the knight at d6. Well, we should have reached the position in diagram 10 now, and I'd like to ask you a question here. Black has an obvious move in playing his rook to c8. Which rook would you move there? Switch off and decide your answer. The choice of rook depends on what you had in mind after white's likely blocking maneuver, bishop to c5. Let's say you played rook from b8 to c8. Then after white bishop to c5, black knight could take on e4 because the bishop is pinned. However, after white queen takes on e4, black rook takes on c5, white rook takes on c5, black queen takes c5. White can here immediately regain his pawn by playing queen takes on b7. As we should also note that after black knight takes on e4, white has an even stronger reply, that is bishop from e2 to b5, attacking the rook at e8. It's clear then why from diagram 10 black chose to play his rook from e8 to c8, as after this, if white moves bishop to c5, he'll simply lose a pawn to knight takes on e4. Well, if you have the right position, that's black's rook from e8 to c8 from diagram 10. White played his bishop from e2 to c4. Black captured, knight takes on c4, and white pawn on b3 took on c4. Black pawn moved to e6. White rook from d5 moved down to d7. Well, we've reached another critical position shown in diagram 11, so please switch off and decide how you would play as black. Well, what was your choice here? Perhaps you were attracted to moving your queen to c6, which attacks the rook and also the c-pawn. But of course, it's no good. After black queen c6, white would go his rook to d1, and after black plays queen takes c4, then rook to d8 check is quite disastrous. Well, maybe you wanted to eliminate white's rook by playing rook to d8 or rook to c7, and both these moves, I think, would give equality, because though white has control of the d file, his pawns are rather weak. Now, the actual move played in the game was the striking bishop to d4, with the idea of following up with pawn to e5, thus blocking the queen file and isolating white's rook at d7. This is very good, and if it works, white is completely smashed. In fact, from this position, white only lasted another 7 moves. However, in the post-mortem analysis, we suddenly noticed that black bishop to d4 is a losing blunder. White could play here rook to b1. And after black goes back to a7, he has to keep his guard on the bishop. Then white plays bishop to d6. This drives the rook away from b8, and then white will crash through on b7. Well, I almost lost an iron norm through that move, bishop d4. But anyway, in the position from diagram 11, white did not play rook to b1. He continued more meekly with rook to d1. And then black moved pawn to e5, continuing his plan. Here white moved his rook from d7 back to d5. I'd like you to switch off again and choose a move for black, preferably a winning one this time. Black's next move was very strong, rook from c8 to c6, not only planning to double on the c file, but where necessary to flick the rook across to f6 on the f-pawn. White responded by moving his pawn to c5, and black moved his rook from b8 to c8. White rook went to b1, black queen to a6. Black's threat is now to move his pawn to b6 to take advantage of the pin against the queen, so white moved it from c2 to d1, incidentally planning to relieve himself by an exchange sacrifice at d4. Black stopped this by moving his queen into c4. At the same time, it threatens something like queen to a2, attacking both the bishop and the f-pawn. White was having to move very quickly now, placed his queen on f3, to which the immediate answer was king to g7. White now played pawn to h4, and black's rook to f6 forced white to resign. I've given this game to show the solidity of the opening, should black desire solidity. White appeared to have pressure early on, but nothing tangible resulted, and a position was reached in which there were dynamically equal chances. You'll find another game, Basman, annotated in the notes. This was a seesaw affair, but the opening performed quite well. I think it's now time to go on to the second type of position you're liable to meet, and that is one which arises when white exchanges early on d5. For our first example game, we shall look at Hartston versus Basman from the Spring Aaronsons International Tournament in 1978. Please reset everything and be prepared for a rather brief encounter. The game began white pawn to d4, black pawn d5, white pawn to c4, pawn to c6, knight to f3, black knight f6. Here Hartston was unwilling to allow black the option of capturing himself at c4, a variation we shall examine later, and himself played pawn takes on d5, black c takes on d5, white knight c3, black knight c6. Completely symmetrical position, foreshadowing a stodgy draw, or perhaps a slight white initiative. White moved his bishop from c1 to f4, perhaps expecting black to move bishop to f5, Then after pawn to e3, black pawn to e6, white queen to b3 could be a source of embarrassment to black. Though even in this case, I think black may have an answer in bishop to b4. Well, from diagram 12, black chose to play his knight to h5. One of many moves. Another one I think is pawn to e6. Now white had a choice of various answers. Well, what shall he do with his bishop? He could play pawn to e3 or bishop to g5. Even bishop to c1 has been tried against me without clear results. The move played by Hartston is probably the most testing. That is white bishop to e5 from f4. Black cannot really take this piece because if knight takes bishop, white would play pawn takes knight, and not only is black's queen's pawn hanging, but white is threatening to play pawn to e3, and then pawn to g4, trapping the knight. Instead, after bishop to e5, I chose to play the double-edged move, pawn to f6, which blocks away black's retreat for the knight, of course. White moved his bishop from e5 back to g3, and now black played queen to a5. This move was perhaps not strictly necessary, but black wished to prevent white from getting in pawn to e4 in the near future. After black queen to a5, white moved his pawn to e3. Black is still delaying his capture of the bishop on g3 because he doesn't want to open the h-file for white. So he played here pawn to e6. White bishop from f1 to d3. Black bishop from f8 to b4. This should be diagram 13. I'd like you to switch off here and decide how you would play as white. Well, please turn over to side 2 if you want to find out how the game actually went. From the position in diagram 13, I think white had many promising continuations. For example, queen to c2, against which black will probably need to play pawn to f5. Also possible is white bishop from g3 to h4, though in this case I'm not sure of the compensation white has if black simply captures on c3 twice. White's choice in the game was knight from f3 to d2. At first sight, looking very strong, since by discovering an attack on the knight at h5, it almost forces an exchange on g3, which in turn opens up the rook file for white. Let us see how the game progressed. Black captured knight takes bishop on g3. White pawn takes knight, h-pawn of course. Black bishop takes on c3. White pawn takes c3. And black queen takes the pawn on c3. Now white got his pawn back. Rook takes on h7. Black rook takes h7. White bishop takes h7. If you thought that white had a good game on the king's side, it's not so serious because of black's firm centre. So black simply moved his bishop to d7 here. preparing to castle queenside. White attacked the black queen with rook from a1 to c1, and black moved away with queen to a3. White checked, queen to h5 check, black king to e7. And now, as the white rook is still under fire, white moved it to c2, though during the game I thought that knight to b3 was superior. In this position, which is diagram 14, you can take the opportunity to demonstrate your analytical abilities and choose black's next move. You'll find this position analyzed in more depth on the tape Positions for Analysis. Here we'll just mention that black knight to b4 is not very crushing, because white will play rook to c7, and then if black plays knight takes a2, white could play queen to g6, and then drop the queen back to c2, with an active attacking position. So, from diagram 14, black played rook from a8 to h8, which almost forces the win of material. Now why is this? Black is threatening bishop to e8 and then out to g6, exploiting the pin on the bishop at h7. If white parries this threat by moving queen to g6, black will just move his king to f8, with variations similar to those occurring in the game. So after black's rook to h8, white thought he could escape by playing pawn to g4. Black continued according to plan with bishop to e8. White moved the attacked queen from h5 back to h2. Naturally, if black carries on regardless here with bishop to g6, he loses after queen c7 check. However, instead of this, he retreated his own queen back to d6. And here white saw to his horror how bad his position was. If he exchanges queens, the bishop at h7 has no real retreat square, since after bishop to d3, black plays knight to b4, white rook c3, black knight takes on d3 check, white rook takes on d3, and now black rook to h1 check. And here, however white answers this check, bishop to b5 wins at least the exchange. In the game after black played queen to d6, white gave up his queen for a rook and knight by moving queen to h3. Bishop g6, white bishop takes g6, rook takes h3. But he did not hold out very long. The black knight to h5 line was tested in another game, Norman versus Basman from Basingstoke 1978. This followed the earlier encounter from diagram 12, so please set up the position of that diagram. Now once again black played knight to h5, white bishop to e5, black pawn to f6, white bishop to g3. Now black continued straight away with pawn to e6, white moved pawn to e3, and black played bishop to b4. White answered this pin more cautiously by playing his rook from a1 to c1. so he'll be ready to play pawn to a3 should black now go queen to a5. Instead, black simply castled here, and white moved bishop to d3. Could you turn off your tapes here and decide how you would continue as black? It is diagram 15. It's now by no means clear how black should continue here, but he had to take steps against white's threat of knight to g5, discovering against the knight. I'd just like to look at this threat in detail to see how dangerous it is. Let's say black makes absolutely no move in diagram 15, and white plays knight to g5. Black must surely capture this knight, since if he plays knight takes on g3, he runs into bishop takes h7 check and h-pawn takes on g3. Again, if he plays after knight g5 pawn to g6, white has a sacrifice, knight takes on h7, king takes h7, and now queen takes h5 check, exploits the pin on the g-pawn. So, as I said, after white knight to g5, black must capture pawn takes on g5. White plays queen takes h5, and now if black plays pawn to g6, white has at least a draw here by bishop takes on g6. Well, I suppose a draw cannot be accounted a disaster for black in this line, but since white in this game had a grading some 25 points lower than mine, he could not be trusted not to take the perpetual. Another possibility, after black's pawn to g6, is for white to play more slowly with queen to h6, followed by pawn to h4 and pawn to h5. Well, enough of pawn to g6. If you have the right position, that is diagram 15 with the moves knight g5, pawn takes g5, white queen takes h5. Let's say black plays here pawn to h6. If white moves in queen to g6, black queen to f6 seems an adequate response. But once again, instead of queen to g6, white could play pawn to h4, which gives him the initiative. Even though these variations do not lead to a forced loss for black, they are fairly unpleasant, and therefore, if you'll return your pieces to diagram 15, we'll see what was played. The actual move played was rook to f7, which deals with the threat of knight to g5, since after f takes g5, white queen takes h5, black could just play pawn to g6, and there's no fear of perpetual check. Rook to f7 doesn't do much more than this, just retains the options of the position. White at this point decided on a new ploy to take advantage of the black knight's position at h5, namely bishop from g3 to h4. The threat is pawn to g4, which could have been answered by pawn to g6, but I was a bit uneasy then about white's possible answer knight to e5, exploiting the pin against the f-pawn. At any rate, I continued pawn to g5. White retreated bishop to g3, and now as there is still a latent threat of white knight takes on g5, I pushed on a little further, pawn to g4. White retreats his knight to g1, and now black expanded in the center with pawn to e5, which incidentally also defends his pawn at g4. White moved his knight from g1 to e2, and black bishop went to e6. Naturally, black doesn't want to play the move pawn to e4, since though this would drive the white bishop back, it would also allow the square f4 to fall into white's hands. But after bishop to e6, white repeated his earlier theme by playing bishop to h4. Black released the pin by playing queen to f8, and white finally castled kingside. Black moved queen to h6. This is diagram 16. I'd like you to switch off here and study the position for about 10 minutes. Then switch back on again. In the position in diagram 16, a natural plan is to continue knight from c3 to a4, trying to make something of the c-file and the c5 square, especially as black cannot here play pawn to b6, since his knight at c6 would be en prise. However, the maneuver seems to lack bite. Black could continue with dropping his knight back to g7, uncovering an attack on the bishop at h4. If white then retreats to g3, black could advance a little further, with queen to g5, threatening pawn to h5 and then pawn to h4. Well, white's actual choice in diagram 16 was the aggressive pawn to e4. This move is aggressive and optimistic, and over the board I was unable to find a satisfactory reply. If pawn to e4 was unexpected to you, you may like to switch off here and try to answer it for black. In the game, black captured on d4 with his pawn, which eventually did not turn out well. A bit of post-mortem analysis digs up the move bishop takes on c3 instead. In answer to this, white's best seems to recapture with the pawn, since knight takes on c3 allows black a strongly outposted knight after knight takes on d4. So pawn takes bishop is critical. If black now moves knight to f4, he's all right if white meekly retreats the bishop to g3. But instead, if white captures knight takes f4 and then plays pawn to g3, the position is by no means clear. Therefore, in the position in diagram 16, adding the moves white pawn to e4, black bishop takes c3, white pawn takes c3, black could choose another move, rook to d8. White appears to have a strong reply here. In pawn takes d5, black bishop takes d5, and white pawn to c4. But then black has a counter. Bishop takes g2, white king takes g2, and black knight to f4 check. White takes on f4, and black plays pawn takes f4. The point of this whole maneuver is that if white now tries queen takes g4 check, rook to g7 pins and wins the queen. Well, I don't think the analysis I've shown you is in any way exhaustive, but we'd better go back to diagram 16 and add the move pawn to e4. In the actual game, I continued with pawn on e5 takes pawn on d4. White answered knight takes d5, black bishop back to d6. White bishop to g3, black moved bishop to e5. Hopefully black has well fortified his d-pawn, but now white sets about capturing it with disconcertingly straightforward moves. He simply plays bishop to c4, black moved king to h8, and now white pawn to b4. This second pawn advance threw me into a long and fruitless consideration of the possibilities, but I could find no way to avoid the loss of the pawn. Eventually I played knight takes on g3. White recaptured h takes g, black rook to d7, white pawn to b5, black bishop takes d5, white pawn takes d5, black knight to e7, white knight takes on d4, black knight takes d5, white bishop takes d5, black rook takes d5. All this, though not completely forced, had been seen by both sides during the long think at move 22, when white played pawn to b4. Here, though the knight at d4 looks to be in a vice-like pin, it escapes easily with knight to f5, attacking the black queen at h6. Black played rook takes d1, and white knight takes h6. This is diagram 17. I'd like you to switch off here and decide how to play as black. It's a question of making the best of a bad job, which one is often called upon to do in over-the-board play when plans have gone astray. The position is a frustrating one for black. He cannot save his g-pawn, and there doesn't seem to be any immediate counterplay. If he tries the aggressive rook to d2, white answers rook f d1, and then if black captures on a2, white just plays his rook down to d7 with threats of knight to f7 and knight takes bishop, and then finally bringing the other rook onto the 7th rank. On the other hand, if black answers white's rook f d1 with rook a8 d8, then white can fork his rooks with knight to f7 check. Another line from diagram 17 is rook takes f1 check, white king takes f1. But this also leaves black with the problem of defending his 7th rank, due to the threats of knight to f7, check takes bishop, or knight takes g4, and once again knight takes bishop. In view of all this, I decided I'd better jettison the g-pawn and just try and defend my 7th row. Thus from diagram 17 I played rook back to d7. White took his pawn, knight takes g4, and black moved his bishop in to d4. This piece at least has been preserved. White now played rook to c2, and black rook a8 to d8. This doubling of the rooks behind the bishop is very important, since white had a threat of moving rook to d2 and the other rook to d1 himself. After black's rook went to d8, white moved rook from f1 to c1, black pawn h5, white knight to h2, black bishop to b6, white knight to f3, and black king to g7. Here white got cold feet and offered a draw. He hasn't been making much progress over the last few moves, and now he became worried that his f-pawn was in danger by such moves as rook to d1 check and rook to f1. I feel that black, despite being a pawn down, has a good enough game, as the bishop is superior to a knight in an open board. At any rate, the draw was agreed. So, an interesting game theoretically. Was white's pawn to e4 the move that pricked the bubble of black's active play on the king's side? Or could black have found a better answer? I think we shall leave the symmetrical variation now and go on to study positions resulting when black captures on c4. Please return once again to the starting position and make the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn c4, pawn c6, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3. Black might choose here moves like pawn to g6 or even the super solid pawn to e6, but he can also give up the center with pawn takes on c4. This capture, which we will make, pawn takes c4, is rather more embarrassing for white than a normal Queen's Gambit accepted, which is why many players either guard their c-pawn at move 3 with pawn to e3 or capture on d5 immediately. The pawn at c6 means that black is ready to give support to his c4 pawn by playing pawn to b5, should white here play pawn to e4. In such positions, it's hard for white to regain the pawn, and he's more likely to gambit it, relying on his pawn center for compensation. Should white wish to recover his c-pawn, he may play, instead of pawn to e4, pawn to e3. But most people play pawn to a4. This is from diagram 18. This move pawn to a4 prevents black pawn to b5 and prepares to regain the c-pawn, either by playing pawn to e3 followed by bishop takes c4, or the maneuver knight to e5 to c4. This last maneuver should be noted because even though it looks long-winded, white may gain from it later by being able to play pawn to f3 and then pawn to e4, building up a very solid center. However, to return to white's move pawn to e4, it is something of a concession. It weakens the squares b4 and b3 and allows settling points for black pieces later in the game. It also makes it rather difficult for white to carry out a queenside advance, say by pawn to b4 to b5, if he wanted to crack open black's queenside position. In the present game, which we are going to look at, played at Basingstoke in 1978 between Shapiro from America and me, these factors do have some effect on the course of the struggle. After white's pawn to a4, black moved pawn to h5. This is of course not regular, though it's scarcely more weakening than white's pawn move on the other wing. Perhaps the more regular move is bishop to f5, and it may well be better. Let's just look quickly at the resulting position after bishop to f5. So play bishop to f5. White could then play pawn to e3, and then perhaps black would play pawn to e6. And after bishop takes c4, I think perhaps a good move for black in this position might be pawn to h6, and this would prepare a retreat for the bishop at h7, should it be necessary to go back. Now let's return again to diagram 18. Play the move pawn to a4 for white, and black bishop to f5. Now here again white could go knight to e5 to regain his pawn that way, and later on play pawn to f3 followed by pawn to e4. I was thinking here that a good answer for black might be pawn to c5, so that if white captures, black could exchange the queens and then develop his knight at d7. Or if white pushes on to d5, black could immediately try to undermine by playing pawn to e6. Anyway, this variation has to be tested in the future. Now let's go back to the game. That's diagram 18. White plays pawn to a4 and black pawn to h5. White now played pawn to e3. Black developed his bishop to f5. White bishop takes c4. Black pawn to e6. White queen to e2. This move prepares pawn to e4, which black could have prevented by moving bishop to b4, but he preferred to allow it to take place. So he played knight from b8 to d7, white moved pawn to e4, and black bishop to g4. I'd like you to switch off the tape here and analyze the consequences of white playing pawn to d5. Should white play pawn to d5, black's answer would be knight to e5. And if pawn takes e6, then black could answer pawn takes e6. One line of further analysis might be bishop to e3, black queen to a5, white pawn h3, black knight takes on e4, white pawn takes on g4, black knight takes on c3, white bishop to d2, black knight takes on e2, white bishop takes on a5. Now black takes on f3 check, white g takes f3, and perhaps black knight to d4, with an unclear position. Well, white clearly didn't wish for complications so early in the game, so let's return to diagram 19. In this position, white guarded his d-pawn with bishop to e3, because black's threat was to play knight to b6, attacking the bishop, and then to play bishop takes f3 and queen takes d4. After white's bishop to e3, black played queen to a5, putting the pressure on the e-pawn. And to counter this threat, white castled kingside at last. Black played his bishop to b4, once again threatening white's pawns. So white here pushed his pawn on with pawn to e5. Black moved his knight to d5. White played knight to e4. I'd like you to switch off here and familiarize yourself with this position. Black is making what capital E can out of the weakened white pawn structure on the queen's wing, and he has been able to settle two pieces at b4 and a5. He has a solid position, and most of his pieces have got good squares. Perhaps his only worry is the square at d6, where white is attacking with a knight and a pawn. But at present, should white play his knight down to d6 at any point, black could just play bishop takes knight, and then move his queen into b4 to pick up that pawn. Now, let's turn to the game and see how black continued. He castled queenside, considering that his king would be very safe on that side, especially as white's pawns on the queen side are all gunged up and cannot move down the board. White moved his rook now from f1 to c1, and black his king from c8 to b8. White played here pawn to h3, and the bishop retreated to f5. Now we get a bit more regrouping of pieces from white. He moves his knight from e4 back to d2. Seeing the knight was going to come to b3 next move, black has to make a square for his queen. He doesn't particularly want to have it retreating back to b6, where it may be hit by pawn to a5. And then he doesn't really want to go back to c7, because there's a concealed pin down the c file. So he makes a d8 square vacant by moving his rook. And he chose to move the rook to c8. Naturally, it could have gone to g8, but that would signal the intentions of a kingside attack rather loudly, and one doesn't want to do that. So black played rook to c8, and white played knight to b3. Black queen went back to d8. White now played his knight from b3 into c5. I'd like you now to switch off again here and decide on your continuation for the black pieces. It's diagram 20. In a position such as this, I think choice of move must depend upon personal taste, for the position is very involved, and though both sides would like to attack the enemy king, it's not so easy to find how to go about it, mainly because there aren't pawn advances available which don't happen to lose pawns. Now black has a number of reasonable looking moves here. Rook to g8, knight takes e3 or pawn to a5, perhaps even capturing on c5. I rejected this last possibility because I did not wish to allow white the opportunity of bringing his knight to the square d4. However, knight takes c5 may well have been the simplest choice. What was the move played? That was pawn to f6, which certainly had the desired effect of bringing matters to a head, but to whose head is another matter, since white appears to have good replies up his sleeve. After pawn to f6, white captured pawn takes on f6, black recaptured pawn takes f6, and now white knight to h4. This is white's idea. Since the line of the black queen to h4 has been blocked, white is able to put his knight there. Of course, black cannot retreat his bishop now, because then white would capture the e6 pawn with his knight. So first, black must play knight takes c5. White pawn takes c5, and black bishop now goes back to h7. Surveying the position, it seems black has done quite well. White's centre has gone, the g-file has been opened up, and also white's knight has gone to h4 rather than to d4. So switch off again here and play a move for white. This is diagram 21. I hope you didn't capture the pawn at h5. That would lose you a knight after black replies bishop to f5. Instead, white captured bishop takes d5, leaving black an uncomfortable choice of recaptures. If he takes back with the c-pawn, white can move queen to b5, and next play pawn to c6 with a crushing attack. If he recaptures queen takes d5, this is unattractive due to rook d1, especially as black's queen to e4, attacking the unguarded knight at h4, would then be refuted by rook to d4, winning a piece. Black therefore, reluctantly, recaptured with the e-pawn, which allows white a post for his knight at f5 for the knight sometime, also a post for the white bishop on d4, and it also leaves the black kingside pawns easy prey for the white pieces, with only nebulous attacking chances in return. During the post-mortem, we looked at various plans for white in this position, and the simple queen takes h5 seemed to set black the most problems. White pawn to a5 also comes into consideration here, but it seemed that black could simply take this pawn, and white's attack was not sufficient to break through. Now back to the game, which is from diagram 21, where white played bishop takes d5, black e takes d5. White's move was queen to f3, which looked the most powerful at the time. And I'd like you to switch off here and choose a defense for black. If you feel a bit lazy, then force yourself to work on it. Black's move here was pawn to a5, finally extinguishing any danger of a queenside attack by white, and also saving the bishop, because of course white was threatening queen to f4 check, forking the bishop and the king. This means that the action is now shifted well and truly to the king's side, and the decision is to be made there. After pawn to a5, white played bishop to d4, a really lovely post for this piece, with the threat of bishop takes f6, forking the queen and the rook. This threat black sidestepped by moving rook to g8, and white, with a choice of pawns, played queen takes h5. Now stop the tape again and choose your reply for black. What move did you choose? Black's bishop at h7 is attacked, and you may have decided to move it, but seeing as bishop to e4 could be answered by white pawn to f3, it seemed to be better to leave the piece where it was for the time being. The move played was rook to c7, guarding the bishop and preparing in some lines to double on the g file. It gives one a rather uneasy feeling to put a rook on the same diagonal as the king, especially with a white bishop nearly waiting to pin it. However, the danger here is more apparent than real. After black rook to c7, white moved his queen back to f3, and it is your turn again as black to switch off and make a move. From diagram 22, black's pawn at f6 once again under attack, and once it falls, white will be able to play bishop e5, pinning the rook at c7. Therefore black played king to h8. Let's just see what happens if white should capture now on f6. Say he plays queen takes f6. In that case, black could move queen to c8, with the threat of queen takes h3. If white answers this with king to h1, then black can move bishop down to d2, not only attacking the rook at c1, but also threatening to play bishop back to g5, winning the knight at h4. So, returning to diagram 22, and adding the move black king to h8, let's try the other capture. Bishop takes f6. Black can once again play queen c8 with threats of rook to f7 or bishop to e4. Say white here goes bishop to e5. Then black has bishop to e4, white queen to e3, black rook to h7, white bishop defends, bishop to g3, and now black rook takes h4, which looks very strong. Let's return again to diagram 22, adding king to h8. As the previous analysis shows, black has been able to tidy up his position and is now ready to go on the offensive. Meanwhile, the disadvantages of white's position are beginning to be felt, particularly the impotence of his rooks, completely shut out of the game by the crisscross of the black bishops. In an effort to activate these rooks, to give them access to e1, white retreated his bishop from d4 to c3. How do you now play as black? Well, you should not capture the c-pawn, as that would be answered by white playing bishop takes a5. Best is bishop to e4, which was played. White queen to f4, black rook from c7 to g7. White tried to block the threat to his g-pawn with pawn to f3, but was clobbered with bishop takes c5 check. White king to h1, black bishop d6, white queen takes on f6. Black could well have played bishop to e7 here, but did not wish to allow white to sacrifice his queen for two rooks by queen takes on g7. Instead he played queen to d7, white bishop to e5, and I think I'll let you make another move for black here. The demolishing move here is rook takes g2. As you can see, every black piece is now in action against the white king, and though two or three of black's pieces are on prise, the rest of them will be quite adequate to deliver the mate. White's last move in this game was knight to f5. Black played bishop takes f3, and white resigned. This final attack, I think, is reminiscent of those arising from the new Caro, and I think it shows that openings are not rigid sets of moves, but allow a certain amount of cross-fertilization. I must now say goodbye, and hope that the material on this cassette will persuade you to try out the line on your own games. If you have any difficulty when you do practice it, then send the games for me and I'll see what I can do.